Hello and welcome to the Good Grief Festival. I'm Liesl Dawson, an associate professor at the University of Bristol, and I'm delighted to be hosting this session where we'll be talking about memory, friendship, grief, and the amazing aerial comedy, The Guy in the Luggage Rack. I'm joined today by two fabulous panelists. Maisie Whitehead is an aerialist, clown, dancer, puppeteer, the artistic director of She Said Jump, and the creator of The Guy in the Luggage Rack. She's joined by Anna Millais, a London-based artist and illustrator. Anna did the illustrations for the zine that accompanies the show, and she's also a close friend of Maisie. Welcome to Good Grief.
Thank you.
So Maisie and Anna, can I start off by just asking you both about your friendship and sort of how you both met?
Sure. We actually met through, well, firstly through our little sisters who were at nursery together, or even play school, I think, like pre-nursery. And then through our mums who got to know each other through that. I think Anna actually remembers this bit better than I do and always tells it very well. So
it's because I remember it through my mum's description, and she always said that Linda kind of went on a mission to make her friend, because my mum was quite shy and Linda was anything but I think Linda just kind of like spied her, got you know, made a beeline for her, and yeah, then they sort of made friends that way. So yeah.
And I think in some ways they were quite an unlikely friendship pair. My mum was quite a lot older than Louise. Louise was very kind of young and cool, and she had really short hair at the time, and yeah, I don't know, they were quite a funny pair, but they just loved each other so much. And they, at the time that they met, my mum had me and my sister, and Louise had 3 children at that point: Anna, her little sister Ella, and then Jamie. And then they both had a kind of like second wave of kids, from which came my 2 brothers and Anna's youngest brother as well, Aidan. And yeah, we just spent kind of, I think, more time together than not, quite a lot of the time. Like, we went on holidays together, we hung out at each other's houses, and yeah, I mean, there's so much and there's so many stories from that time. But yeah, the Millais were like our family, really, and I think that was a mutual feeling. And we lived just around the corner from each other, which was very handy. And we were all very close as kids, and then kind of, I think particularly Anna and I became even closer almost as adults, or like in the way that you have a different kind of relationship when you're an adult to when you were a kid. And we were already really good close friends at the point that my mum was diagnosed with cancer, which was 2015, I think. And all of Anna's family were very present in that time and really supportive. And then very sadly, about 8 months into my mum's diagnosis, Louise was also diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. Anna's mum, Louise, my mum is Linda, Anna's mum is Louise. And so they sort of suddenly, weirdly, found themselves in this very parallel situation. And Anna, do you want to say a bit about?
Yeah, so my mum went into hospital because she had she'd been having issues with her stomach, and she went into hospital and they diagnosed it with cancer, and then it was very, very late stage and aggressive, and she died 7 weeks after. So she was diagnosed in November and died in January. So it was this weird kind of parallel of Linda having this quite long diagnosis and then death, and my mum having this very short, weird sort of diagnosis and then death. But yeah, they both died in 2016, so it was a very strange sort of like parallel end to them both. So yeah, it was very, very unexpected.
Awful. And I mean, they're sort of having this happen to them at the same time, but actually that means in some ways their friend is not there as the support person, because they're kind of going through their own pain and sort of medical emergency event. That must have been so difficult for both of you.
I think in those earlier months of Mum's diagnosis, Louise was just there so much of the time, and then obviously she became ill, and I might be remembering this wrong, Anna, but my memory is that there wasn't a huge amount of time between her becoming suddenly very ill, getting diagnosed, and then obviously, as you said, there was a very short time between that diagnosis and her death. And I mean, my mum was absolutely devastated, and she really wanted to be there for Louise in that time, but I think she found it really, really hard because of what she was going through and everything that it was bringing much more into light. I think she'd had quite a good few, although they were both diagnosed with stage 4 cancer of different varieties. My mum had quite a few months of being fairly symptom free, and then when Louise got diagnosed was around about the time that she started experiencing symptoms, and I have no doubt that the stress of Louise's illness was involved in that, and the grief of losing her. And then my mum died some like 6 months after Louise, I think, more or less, just over. And the Millais had the most beautiful funeral for Louise, which obviously we all were there for, in a little chapel and in the graveyard that's around the corner from where we all grew up, which is actually also where I live. And they, in true Millais fashion, in the perfect ode to Louise, there was absolutely nothing kind of traditional or formal about it, and it was just very beautiful and very meaningful. And it was quite a small group of us, and her casket was covered in flowers, and my mum knew that she wanted the same kind of send-off in the end, and it was different. Mum's was, I think, like Anna said at the beginning, Louise was quite a shy, private person, and my mum was the opposite of that. She just wanted to talk to everyone, whether they wanted to or not, and she was like quite kind of overzealous and theatrical all the time, and a bit loud and a bit mad. And the funeral was a bit like that, but then also, I suppose, similarly, we just decided to do it our own way, and we in the same way that the Millais had, we sort of officiated it ourselves, which was nice. We all spoke, and it was in the same place, and then they were buried next to each other, which is kind of a fitting and poetic end to such a beautiful friendship, really. So they are buried head to foot, which I think my mum and both of them would probably find quite funny. And just up the road in Sheen Cemetery.
Yeah, I think my mum's feet on your mum's head, maybe.
Yeah.
Oh, that's a really, I mean, painful but also quite beautiful story of their friendship and the two families coming together.
Yeah.
Did you find, I mean, very different deaths in a way, with what, Maisie, your mum getting more time in a way to speak to people and prepare, and Anna, yours with such speed. And do you think this had an impact on your own kind of experience of grief? Did you find that you, as friends, grieved quite differently, or that you were able to share things with one another?
Should we go for it, Anna?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like our grief was kind of all tied up in each other because we were also both grieving for the other's mum that we were both really close to. And as families, we're both quite emotional. I think one of the things that Linda was always very good at was getting people to talk and, you know, getting your feelings out there. And she was good at like doing that with my mum. And I think it was kind of in sharing the emotion that I guess we kind of, I mean, obviously we had our own ways of grieving, but having a family we were so close to and so kind of in tandem with, to grieve alongside, and just to be able to share like all of the things that we were feeling and all of the, and it, to be able to like laugh about stuff as well. I think that was really important, because we knew we were both going through this like, you know, deep well of pain, but to be able to know that someone else is going through that as well, but you can also laugh and it's not going to be weird.
No, that's lovely. And actually, one of the things that's often said is really about the loneliness of grief and the way in which we've lost a sense of community when we're grieving and people we can turn to. So it's almost as if, as two families, you were able to have a bit more of that community and not feel quite so isolated.
It's funny because I know we're going to talk about the show in a bit, but I often think this about the character that I wrote for the show, that she's very lonely and very alone, and I wasn't. Although I experienced those moments of aloneness and loneliness, but it wasn't really the picture of my life. And I think that is like a big chunk of that is to do with going through it with my siblings and my family, but also going through it with Anna and her siblings. And I think the thing of being able to laugh about things is like, it's such a tricky thing. Like, I'm sure it's way trickier if you're not the person grieving. But if, as the person grieving, I don't want to make someone else feel uncomfortable, but the humor is quite dark a lot of the time. And like I remember saying to my sister, not like probably only days or like a couple of weeks after Mum died, like I'd been sitting with her dead body after she died, and I was holding her hand when she died. So, I'm sorry, tell me if this is too much, Liesl.
No, please.
I was holding her hand as she died, and like you know, they're like, as after someone dies, eventually rigor mortis starts to set in, their body starts to become very stiff. So her hand kind of like sort of stayed in the position of holding mine, which was kind of amazing and emotional and beautiful, and also a bit weird in itself. And then, as your mind does in these moments, my brain started going, well, I'm not going to let go. That's it. I'm not going to let go. And then I started thinking, well, I'm going to have to go about my everyday life at some point. I'll just have to chop it off and keep it. And like, I couldn't say that to many people, but like saying it to my sister and saying it to Anna is just like, yeah, you get it. You get that it's like in these moments of like the darkest depths of the worst thing you can imagine happening.
Well, there is a kind of absurdity to death, you know, there's a kind of craziness that, that the comedy allows for kind of opposite things to stand together. And I think that makes sense. And of course, your show brings together real, silly, almost childish comedy with, you know, funny, with really serious subjects and treatment of loss. So I think it's common to feel this comedy aspect actually in serious moments. You both have engaged creatively with your grief and what's happened to you, and I'm interested to know whether there was a period where you didn't feel you could do anything creative, you know, to sort of engage in that way. If there was a moment when you suddenly felt you wanted to move toward expressing your experiences and your feelings creatively, sort of when did that process start happening? How did that take place?
So I was actually in the middle of an art foundation when my mum died. So I'd kind of, I was in the middle of it, and then she got diagnosed and obviously then died very quickly. And I sort of left the course, not left, but I wasn't obviously going in and stuff in the up to the weeks when she was dying. And I kind of had a bit of a, oh, should I go back? Should I not go back? But then I just thought, if I don't go back, what am I going to do? Just sort of sit around and weep, you know, with my black hanky and my veil. So I decided to go back, and I actually did my final project on losing my mum and grief and death, and I kind of took a deep dive. And since then, so after the Art Foundation, I went and did a MA in illustration, and I basically became completely obsessed with everything death related. And my final project for that was to do with death, but was not to do with my mum. So interestingly, the Art Foundation final project was thinking about my mum, thinking about death and thinking about grief. But then I kind of took a bit of a step back and went in this deep dive into grief and all of its facets, and death in a really kind of visceral way, but stepped away from it being connected to my mum. And it's actually taken me probably until I've kind of had this idea percolating for the last 6 years since my mum died, but it's only really now that I'm sort of starting on this project where I'm thinking about grief and my mum again. So it kind of happened straight away, but then I had to step back, and so I sort of it's kind of interesting how that happened. So I think it's taken me a long time, maybe outside of the initial grief, to revisit that.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
I think sorry, just to add, like it I'm thinking as you're speaking, Anna, the thing that was tricky was getting enough distance from the experience. I suppose we're talking about creating from that experience rather than creating in general, and it took me quite a while to get enough distance from it that I could like see something which would maybe communicate, rather than just being completely in it. And anything, I feel like if I tried to make something from that place, and actually I did, it just wouldn't have been as effective, because I didn't have any perspective on it, and therefore I couldn't share that perspective. And I think that process of starting to get a bit of perspective was the point that I felt like, okay, now I have some energy to try and make this happen. And obviously when you're creating theatre, you need quite a lot of that energy to make it happen, because it's bloody expensive and you need loads of stuff, particularly for aerial theatre. But yeah, that distancing was really important.
Well, it brings us sort of interestingly straight to the show, because the guy in the luggage rack, and I'll, you can say some more, you can correct me, but it's essentially about the guy in the luggage rack who is a kind of personification of grief, and wants Daisy, not Maisie, but Daisy's attention. But initially Daisy can't see him, can't speak to him, but it's a kind of survival instinct. I mean, she's sort of pushing him away or not wanting to look at him, but some of that is just so she can get through every day, isn't it? So there's also sometimes people, don't engage particularly with grief immediately because it's almost too overwhelming, and it's a way of coping. But have I characterized the show correctly? Do you want to jump in? Yeah.
Yeah, I suppose I feel like it's important to say that it is kind of an allegory. Is that the right word? I'm not sure. It's not start again. It's like a small window on an experience, and it's also one character's experience. And so she, for the purpose of making an interesting narrative, she has this very clear trajectory of going from a place of not being able to see him, like you said, and just experiencing all the difficult stuff that he's throwing her way, which is not him being horrible, it's just him trying to get her attention. And then she starts to see him but still finds him a bit annoying, and then she realizes that he's a bit useful and might have some things to offer, and then they kind of have this sense of catharsis at the end, where she gets to experience some memories of her mum, and then they sort of put aside their differences, and that's for the story, but that is not my experience, and that's why she's Daisy and not Maisie. And I don't know that, well, I think it's unlikely that many real people's experience is that linear, but I think you can go through these cycles just sometimes within like an hour or like a minute, you know, where you're just like, oh, I can't, no, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to do it. Oh, okay, I'm going to do it. Oh no, now I've got to get on with stuff. And you just like, you know,
it's cyclical. It's cyclical.
Yeah.
I think it's the show is careful, I think, to say that this isn't the story of a movement from, you know, grief to sort of getting over grief. The show is very careful not to say that.
Absolutely.
But it does stage a movement from a world where grief is being absolutely pushed away and denied to one in which Daisy's making space for grief.
Yeah.
And allowing grief to be part of her life in a sense. So that's in a way, if there's something linear, it's about accepting grief as a kind of component to her day-to-day existence. But what made you personify grief? What was the idea? Where did that come from? I'm interested in turning grief into a character. And I'm also very conscious of the fact that this is quite a common artistic practice. So how did that happen for you?
I mean, I obviously had in my brain bank various experiences of other artists working in similar ways, but I wasn't conscious of taking one of those and recreating it as such, although I suppose I was aware that it wasn't particularly an original idea from the beginning. But for me, the starting point was, well, I talked about the seed of the idea before, and that was very much at that point where it was coming up for a year after Mum died, and it was getting to that point of feeling like just like the anxiety and the panic of like trying to keep going with all the things, all the life things and work, and I do actually teach, although I don't teach literature as the character Daisy does, and I don't teach in a school, but that experience of having to kind of be present for other people was pushing me into a place of just feeling anxiety a lot of the time, but it was coming out in really silly ways, like you know, almost having a panic attack because my car stalled at the traffic lights and things like that, you know. And so I could see, even in that moment, I could see that some of my reactions were a bit funny, like the things that I was panicking about were like sometimes a bit absurd, and it I wanted to use that. I think I'm interested in feelings and the way we think about them and the way we sort of, I don't know, the way we build stories around them. And I think I wanted to take a bit of the power out of the anxiety that I was experiencing, and seeing the comedy in it actually just was a bit helpful for me. It's like,
it is very funny.
Yeah.
And I think there is something very powerful about externalizing grief as a kind of character with whom I think have a relationship.
But the comedy was the first thing that I wanted to make, a comedy about grief and anxiety, and the memory stuff actually came later, but I couldn't find the comedy when it was just me and there was nothing to play off. It was originally going to be a solo piece. There was nothing to play off, and then Malik and I worked together on a different thing, and he, funnily enough, in the rest of his life, this is my co-performer Malik Ibhais, he, in the majority of his work situations, he plays scary monsters, like actually terrifying monsters, but I find him really funny, and the character was kind of built around him. And we were watching some video of something together, which wasn't very much like what we've created at all, but it was a video where all these circus performers were like playing the kind of interior experience of this character, although everyone could see them. So this ordinary woman was walking around with all these, I can't remember what the name of that film was, but it definitely was, it really spoke to me and to him at the time. We were watching that together, and I was like, oh, that's what's missing to make it funny, is that the thing that's doing this stuff to her has to be a person, and like it's a person trying to get her attention. It's a person, like, you know, hugging her, which she experiences like as I can't breathe, you know, or like sort of waving in front of her face to try and get her attention, which she experiences like a bit of a migraine. And because he is this kind of wonderful, innocent presence, he sort of manages to play this really benign character, who just happens to be causing these issues for Daisy because she's trying to avoid him. So yeah, that was the birth of the character. And then from there, it's like, oh, this is what it's about. This is what makes it funny, is their relationship.
Absolutely. And I think we get a sense, though, of the shift in her sense of him. And there are moments where he's a little bit scary or menacing, or certainly we feel Daisy's fear. I like the way, you know, her day-to-day life is constantly disrupted, things move around, and her home space becomes uncomfortable and a bit uncanny. You know, he keeps turning off and on the light. She thinks she's done this. And I think that's a grief experience, that you don't feel on top of things. Well, how did that get there? Why isn't this here? But also the house being alien again, the places that used to be safe, somehow feeling unsafe. There's a lovely moment when the bed, you know, tips upwards, and you get the kind of scary dreams, but also just that sense of how difficult it is to feel comfort and peace. And, you know, so I think things like that work really beautifully with the kind of visual comic interaction, and the tone can keep shifting as it moves along. Yeah, so it's a great relationship, really. I love all the stuff at the school as well, and, you know, Daisy trying to keep it together, asking about Romeo and Juliet and death, and talking about emotions that she herself is pushing away, which is really good. Can I ask about, there's a great moment with the co-worker. The kind of co-worker comes along and is absolutely infuriating. We hear the kind of voiceover and speaks to Daisy with a kind of series of cliches, you know, oh, keep your chin up, you have to toughen up, you know, she's in a better place, all of that. Was that, you know, could you say a bit more about that scene? Was that,
Sure.
yeah.
I can't remember where the original idea for that scene came from, but the very first bit of practical research we did. So from the beginning of developing the idea into a story, I worked with another friend of mine who's a writer and a comic actress, and Lizzie Muncie, and she helped me to kind of flesh out my ideas into more of a narrative. And then she, myself and Malik got together, and we managed to convince Adrian Berry at Jackson's Lane that he should just give us some free studio space. And we it was sort of the agreement was like, if he likes what we did in the 3 days that he gave us, then he might consider giving us a bigger residency kind of thing. And luckily he did, otherwise I don't think we'd be here. But that Jean is the character, is the colleague Jean. She came out of that very first bit of R&D, and she wasn't in the original story that Lizzie and I had written, but she also then, after that R&D, kind of faded into the background for a while and then came back for the show. But I suppose I think Lizzie just improvised for ages, throwing together all the cliches that she could and being really deliberately annoying. And then Malik and I just played off that, and we filmed loads of stuff. And it was just really fun. It was really fun to play with the opposites, you know, of like Daisy trying to be polite and reasonable and just, yeah, like,
it's wonderful. Well, I think the character really gives so many infuriating cliches about grief that I think when you're grieving is really intolerable. And also she keeps asking Daisy how she is, but won't listen for an answer, and won't really acknowledge her grief as something valid and real. And I love the way that, you know, the guy in the luggage rack is fighting with to get forward.
What it became was like, I suppose in that moment he is more her inner experience than necessarily specifically her grief, and he's like, and she is a bit furious, but she doesn't feel like it's okay to like show that. And I think she's also like, we didn't want to paint Jean as a complete, you know, dick, excuse my language, but keep it fairly
yeah
gentle.
No, absolutely.
We like, people do their
people
best.
are trying people are trying,
yeah,
they're
and
just also very trying.
Absolutely.
Yes.
But I think when you're in the midst of it all, it like, you just are quite frazzled quite easily by things. Yeah. And then when you're going through something so huge and someone is really trying but doesn't have that experience and almost like desperately wants to say something, and it'd be almost better if they just were like, how are you? You know, like, you know, how's it going?
Absolutely. But it's a great way of showing the sort of behind the scenes of what's happening in Daisy's mind. Can I ask about, so one of the crucial things, Daisy opens the show talking about how she lost her mum. She knows she didn't, you know, she didn't really lose her mum. She knows her mum has died, but she's lost her memories of her mother. And one of the really powerful things is her mum's red jacket, her coat. And the guy in the luggage rack brings it out, tries to get her to see it. She keeps pushing it away. And really the key moment comes when she allows herself to see the coat and actually has a memory of her mother. And this sort of opens her back up to those feelings and those memories. Can you say a little bit more about that moment in the show and how the coat kind of functions?
I think there's a couple of different levels, really. There's the level of the objects are very powerful and sensory stuff around objects, particularly clothes. Clothes retain a smell of the person often for a long time, or like the feeling of a particular fabric can take you right back to a memory, really, like in a very immediate kind of way. So then there's also the level of like not being quite either able or willing, or a combination of the two, to face memory in general of a person, because it's obscured by difficult memories, or maybe because the experience of facing and remembering those things that are beautiful and loving that happened with that person are just too painful because that person is dead. And so I suppose at the beginning, Daisy's kind of haunted by the very dark memories of her mum's final moments. And I think probably anyone who's watched someone die to cancer can relate to that. It's not a pretty thing. And those very strong images can kind of obscure other nicer stuff. And I think for the character, the fear of those scary memories is like contributing to her pushing away all memories and her grief at the same time. And Ian, the grief, who we don't actually refer to as Ian in the show, but that was his name in rehearsals. I suppose we needed to figure out what his purpose was, like why was he there? Because he's not just there to just be annoying. He's not trying to be annoying. He's trying to do something good. He's trying to like help her remember in a way, or like help her connect with her feelings and help her retain a relationship. And that was another thing that was kind of reflected back to me by another person as a really important bit of the story, which then became like the central line of the story, really, was that the trajectory is like Daisy and / Ian are trying to find a way for her to continue to have a relationship with her mum. And at the beginning, she doesn't know how, or she can't. And then through their relationship softening, she's able to be like, okay, what are you trying to get me to do? What are you trying to get me to see? And what he's trying to get her to see is this coat, which is her mum, and what's the memory of her mum, I suppose. And then they have this moment that you're referring to, of this very kind of ordinary memory. I didn't want it to be like a kind of big, like exciting, kind of significant thing, because those things are kind of easier to remember. But actually the ordinary day-to-day, like hanging out, that's the hardest bit. But that's also, for me anyway, personally, like where so much of the relationship lies. And in those sort of very familiar gestures and those very familiar moments of like physical contact, and the little routines that we go through over and over again that might be a bit annoying. Like there's a moment where the mum, the puppet, the memory of the mum, sees that Daisy's got a bit of like ketchup or something on her face, and goes to grab a hanky from her sleeve and then spits on it and then tries to wipe it off her face. And Daisy's an adult and she doesn't want her mum's gross spitty hanky all over her face. And it needed that for me, because that like three-dimensionality of a relationship, of it not just being like, it's all lovely, was for me what enabled, like remembering that three-dimensionality in those ordinary bits and those slightly annoying bits, was what enabled me to sort of like get back to a point of being able to feel like I had a relationship with my mum after she died. But yes, also connecting with those memories is painful and sad and beautiful at the same time. I suppose anything really full of love and loss, it's never going to be easy.
Maisie, that's really beautiful, and I feel like you described that wonderfully. And I think what's so moving, I've now watched the show more than once, and it doesn't fail to make me laugh and to make me cry. And it is that sense of this relationship with her mother, which gets in a way reactivated and brought into the present, and the coat that was pushed away becomes a source of memory, and then she wears it, she makes it part of herself. And I love the way also you have very few props, but the way they move around the space, they're a bed, they're a cage, they're a boat, and then eventually, having reconnected with her mother, they become this amazing swing where she's almost flying through the air. And you get the sense of her opening herself up again to her past and her life in a different mode, from the kind of very closed, pushing away from memory, pushing away from the past. But I think you sort of have said that really beautifully. So thank you. I'm slightly conscious of time, and I do want to get to the zine, which is another important element of the show. And this is where I get to say that I got to come in, which was lovely. So I was able to be a part of hearing about the show, talking about the story, and then with the most wonderful, fabulous researcher, Rachel Hare, with whom I do lots of projects, and my PhD student. We worked with you to write the content of the zine, and Anna has done the most amazing, beautiful illustrations. And so I really want to turn to Anna and talk a bit more about those illustrations and hear about how you came up with the concept. I can see in the background some of them behind you. Can you talk to us about the zine and about your illustrations and contribution?
Yeah, so I mean, I didn't do a lot before I got the first draft of writing from you. I kind of just did a bit of sketching of Maisie and Malik from stills from that I got from the videos of the rehearsal that Maisie had sent. So I kind of started just sketching them a bit, sketching some of their expressions in the show, and kind of letting ideas sort of percolate like that. But after the first draft, and after sort of watching bits of the show through a few times, I kind of just, it's quite hard to kind of describe how I come up with things sometimes, but it often is by doing stuff like this kind of page here. I just sort of, you know, slosh things around and do some drawings, and often having lots of things on one page kind of makes it come together for me. And the whole idea of the kind of pattern that goes through the zine was, it's something that I often revert to as a like as a sort of way of mark making. It's something that kind of developed when I was doing my MA, and I think came from the fact that I really love drawing hair, and also that I do these kind of very meditative drawings where I just do mark making, and I always revert back to this kind of swirly flowing mark making. But the thing that I really like about it is that it can be hair, it can be muscle, it can be smoke, it can be water, it can kind of, you know, transform itself into whatever you want or need it to be. And that was the kind of idea when I was thinking about grief.
Sorry.
Okay.
No, I love that. I love that because I love the way that the lines sort of almost change their meaning as they move across the different pages. And again, it reminds me, what resonates for me is the way it functions like that piece of set in the show that keeps being reimagined, and you know, it keeps turning up in with different forms and different meanings. And we do have waves and ocean in the show, and we have the boat in the zine, and we have the sense of hair, but also the idea of grief, you know, the kind of waves of grief and the patterns. So yeah, it's really beautiful. I love it.
Yeah, I'm glad that that comes across, because that's what I was going for, that grief is, it kind of transforms itself into many different things. It kind of gets into many different cracks. It kind of, you know, balloons and then sort of shrinks, and it kind of, yeah, sort of it molds itself into different things. And I think that's what having this kind of slightly sort of, you know, this substance that is not necessarily anything in particular, but can turn into lots of different things. And I work a lot with ink as well, and I was kind of working off this idea of, like, there's one image where it's the suitcase, and Daisy is trying to, you know, shut the grief in a suitcase, or shut the memory away in a suitcase. And the thing with ink is that, you know, if you use it with water, it kind of bleeds out. So I was kind of working with this idea of, you know, the grief bleeding out into parts of her life, even though she's trying to stop it, but it's kind of, you know, it's an impossible task, she can't do it. And so the ink, the sort of swirliness, bleeds into the memory, it bleeds into Daisy's head, it bleeds into the suitcase, it bleeds into but then it also, as you're going through the scene, that pattern connects up as one image. So I kind of really wanted to link all the images and have them really kind of, you know, dancing into each other and connecting up to kind of show how all of those things are part of a whole rather than being isolated things. And I made things really difficult for myself by also deciding that I was going to make it so that the first and last images of Daisy and Ian, if you cut those up and put them together, they also connect. So it connects with all the ones in the middle, but it also connects them, just the two of them. And I kind of really wanted to capture expressions, like I wanted to capture Ian as this kind of, you know, sort of friendly, but maybe doesn't necessarily look super friendly, and Daisy is not necessarily looking like she doesn't want to be, you know, near Ian, but slightly worried. So having that kind of, almost like they want to connect, but they're slightly turned away from each other, so it's a kind of complicated connection. But I mean, it all came from, obviously, the, you know, my inspiration was Maisie's show. It was Maisie's show. It was Liesl's writing. It was kind of, you know, I had a lot to be inspired by.
Yes, and Rachel, we can't forget Rachel.
Oh yeah, and Rachel as well.
She did a huge amount. It was very much a collaborative act, you know, but that's beautifully described. And I think I love the idea of having a long frame of all the images connected together. And I love the image of Ian, or the guy in the luggage rack at the end, with the kind of weather almost moving through him. Maisie, do you want to come in at all about the zine? Is there anything you want to say about this component?
I suppose I had an idea a long time ago that it might be nice to have something that people could take away with them that would be a kind of a bit of a reflective aid or something, and also was a bit aware of like dealing with this topic, which is quite very personal to a lot of people, and lots of people, and that I just know my experience, and you know, a little bit about the people I've talked to along the way and the things I've read, and that everybody's experience is really different. And so I sort of wanted something to go with that would just enable people, I suppose, to kind of think about their own experience of grief, if that's relevant to them, or the other people they might know that were going through that. And obviously Anna is my mate and an outrageously talented artist, but also the fact that we've gone through this together just felt completely right, that we should do this together. And also it gave me an opportunity to bring her into the project in a way that live theatre doesn't always allow for illustration, and I just wanted her voice in there, and I have to say, I feel like I just kind of went, here you go guys, here's a story, and then I didn't really have much to do with the creating of the zine beyond that. It just it was very I felt quite humbled just kind of watching it come into being through you and Rachel's words, Liesl, and then Anna's images, and then obviously me and Anna sat around the dining table at like 11 p.m. on a Thursday, stapling in a huge production line. Yeah, but it was
a tremendously rewarding process, and Rachel and I both have loved being able to be part of it and to watch the show sort of grow and shift a bit, and to be able to contribute. I feel like we're getting to a very nice place, really, where we should probably wrap up. Maybe we could edit in some of the links to the zine and to your show, if people haven't seen the show and are watching on Watch Again, and so therefore can't watch it, they can at least get a taste of it there.
And we hope to be taking it out on the road again next year. I should shove that in there.
Yes, absolutely. So there may also be more opportunities.
Yeah, I hope that there will be more opportunities to see it live. Yeah.
Well, I will just finish then by thanking both you, Maisie, and Anna, for sharing your stories about your friendship and your mums, and also for a really rich conversation about the guy in the luggage rack.
Thank you.
So thank you both so much for joining Good Grief Festival, and thank you to everybody for watching, and bye for now.